One day, you're going to ask why we didn't drive exciting cars, why the photos show dull colors, small engines, shapes that look apologetic, not proud. And when you do, you need to understand this first. We didn't choose those cars because we liked them. We chose them because the world left us no room to choose anything else. There was a time when buying a car wasn't about passion or image or enjoyment. It was about fear. Fear of losing a job, fear of fuel prices jumping overnight, fear that the next paycheck wouldn't stretch as far as the last one did. Standing in those showrooms, we weren't thinking about horsepower or styling. We were thinking about school fees, groceries, heating bills. We were thinking about whether a single bad decision could derail an entire family. The cars you'll see today were never meant to be loved. They were meant to last long enough to get us to work, long enough to keep food on the table, long enough to buy time for a future that hadn't arrived yet. Your future. Some of these cars promised savings and delivered stress. Others promised reliability and quietly fell apart, and a few did exactly what they were supposed to do, even if nobody ever felt proud owning them. Today, I'm going to tell you the stories we didn't tell at the time, the compromises, the regret, the moments we realized too late that the brochure had lied and the bank account hadn't. Because one day, when you look back at the choices we made, I don't want you to see boring cars. I want you to see the cost of survival. To understand why those choices were made, you have to understand how narrow the margins were. This wasn't a period of optimism. It was a period of restraint. Money didn't disappear overnight. It eroded, slowly, quietly, month by month. Fuel prices became unpredictable, not expensive in a dramatic way, unstable in a dangerous way. You could afford petrol one week and panic about it the next. That uncertainty alone changed how families thought about cars. At the same time, wages weren't keeping up. Pay rises lagged behind inflation. Savings lost value just sitting still. A car payment wasn't just a purchase, it was a long-term risk calculation. Cars that had once felt normal suddenly felt irresponsible. Large engines meant exposure. Heavy bodies meant consumption. Anything that looked indulgent carried guilt. Manufacturers saw this pressure and they responded fast. Sometimes too fast. They rushed smaller engines into larger bodies. They promised efficiency without fully understanding durability. They cut costs in places families would only discover years later. Dealerships leaned hard into reassurance. Words like economical, sensible, forward-thinking, they appeared everywhere. Nobody advertised joy. They advertised safety, financial safety, and families listened, because when the margin for error disappears, you stop dreaming and you start calculating. The car stopped being an extension of personality and became an extension of the household budget. Every mile mattered. Every breakdown threatened more than inconvenience. It threatened stability. So when you see the cars we bought, don't judge them as objects. Judge them as decisions made under pressure, with incomplete information, in a world that felt like it was tightening, not expanding. These weren't bad choices made by careless people. They were cautious choices made by people who couldn't afford to be wrong. And now that you understand the pressure, we can start looking at the cars themselves, beginning with one that promised responsibility and delivered something very different. When this car was bought, nobody thought they were making a mistake. They thought they were being responsible. The Ford Pinto arrived as an answer to a question families didn't want to ask. What happens if fuel keeps getting more expensive? Compact size, low sticker price, easy monthly payments. By the late 1970s, this wasn't marketed as a cheap car, it was marketed as a smart one. In 1978, a Pinto could be bought new for roughly $4,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's about the price of today's cheapest new cars. It's right in the danger zone, affordable enough to tempt, but cheap enough to hide compromises. Families weren't chasing excitement, they were chasing predictability, technical reality. WHATU actually got under the bonnet. The Pinto offered simplicity. Inline 4 engines, 1.6 or 2.0 liters, producing around 70 to 90 horsepower depending on year and tune. Rear-wheel drive, live rear axle. Old-fashioned even when it was new but familiar to mechanics. Fuel economy looked good on paper. Maintenance looked cheap. Parts were everywhere from an engineering standpoint. This was a car built quickly, not carefully. Weight reduction mattered more than reinforcement. Cost targets mattered more than long-term durability, and that would matter badly. The problems WHAT brochures didn't say the Pinto's reputation wasn't ruined by one issue. It was ruined by what happened when everything went wrong at once. The most infamous problem involved the fuel tank's placement behind the rear axle. In certain impacts, the tank could rupture. Not in high-speed crashes, sometimes at speeds families thought were survivable. This wasn't a secret. Internal documents showed the risk was known early, but fixes were weighed against cost and cost won. Beyond that, quality control was inconsistent. Electrical faults, premature rust. Interior materials that aged faster than the loan. Ownership became stressful in a way no spreadsheet could predict. Family stories how this affected real lives in neighborhoods across the country. Pintos became cautionary tales. Parents drove them gently. They avoided highways when possible. They parked further away from traffic. Some families traded them early, absorbing financial losses just to sleep better. Others kept them and lived with constant low-grade anxiety. This wasn't embarrassment, it was tension. The car that was supposed to reduce stress quietly added more of it. Legacy WHAT. This car left behind the Ford Pinto didn't just damage trust in one model. It changed how people thought about manufacturers. It taught families a brutal lesson. A cheap car can become expensive in ways money can't measure. If there's one reason this car belongs in this story, it's this. It shows how being forced to choose sensible can still leave you exposed. And if you think this was an isolated mistake, the next car proves it wasn't. This was the car people bought when they wanted to feel clever. The Lancia Beta didn't shout. It didn't flex. It whispered sophistication. Front-wheel drive when most family cars weren't. European handling. Italian design. It looked like a step forward, especially for buyers who wanted to feel they'd outgrown basic domestic transport. To many parents, this felt like progress. A car that said, "We're thinking long-term." Technical promise what sold the dream. On paper, the Beta looked advanced. Inline 4 engines ranging from 1.6 to 2.0 liters. Power outputs around 100-120 horsepower, healthy for the time. Independent suspension all around. Disc brakes, sharp steering. This was engineering-led. Marketing. The idea was that clever design could compensate for rising fuel costs without sacrificing comfort. For families tired of crude solutions, this mattered. The reality where everything unraveled, the problem wasn't that the Beta was badly designed. It was that it was badly protected. Rust became the defining issue and not cosmetic. Rust, structural rust, subframes corroded, suspension mounting points weakened, floors disappeared from the inside out. Some cars became unsafe in under 5 years. Electrical gremlins added insult, intermittent faults, dashboard failures, starting issues that mechanics struggled to diagnose. Repairs weren't cheap, and parts weren't always available. Independent garages often refused to touch them. Ownership turned into a financial bleed rather than a single disaster. Family experienced the slow drain. This wasn't a car that failed spectacularly. It failed incrementally. Every inspection brought new warnings. Every service uncovered another problem waiting its turn. Families delayed holidays, put off home repairs, kept the car longer than they should have because selling it meant admitting defeat. Some owners genuinely loved how the Beta drove, which made letting go even harder. That's the cruelest kind of failure, when the thing hurting you also reminds you what you hoped for. Legacy, the cost of trusting clever. The Lancia Beta didn't just damage household budgets, it damaged trust in European engineering promises. For many families, this was the moment enthusiasm gave way to caution. Style and sophistication stopped being advantages. They became risks. If the Pinto showed how cost-cutting could endanger families, the Beta showed how complexity could quietly ruin them. And next, we move to a car that sat right between those two worlds: smaller, cheaper, and supposedly foolproof but still capable of disappointment. This was supposed to be the safe option. The Chevrolet Vega wasn't exotic. It wasn't ambitious. It was sold as honest transportation from a company families already trusted. General Motors didn't pitch the Vega as exciting. They pitched it as sensible, modern, and efficient, the kind of car you bought when you wanted to stop worrying. By the mid-1970s, that message landed hard. Parents wanted normality back. They wanted something familiar that didn't feel like a gamble. On the showroom floor, the Vega looked like stability. Under the bonnets at GM's bold experiment, an all-aluminum 2.3-liter inline-4 engine. On paper, it was advanced, lightweight, efficient, modern. In practice, it was unforgiving. The engine lacked cylinder liners, cooling tolerances were tight. Overheating even once could warp the block permanently. This wasn't an engine designed for neglect, short trips, or imperfect maintenance. And that mattered because this was exactly how family cars were used. Suspension and brakes were basic. Interior materials were thin. Rust protection was minimal. The Vega wasn't built to age. It was built to meet targets. Engine failures came early. Coolant loss led to overheating. Overheating led to irreversible damage. Oil consumption became common. Cold starts were inconsistent. Repairs were expensive relative to the car's value. Then came the rust, wheel arches, floors, doors. Cars showed corrosion within 2 winters in harsh climates. This wasn't abuse, it was normal use. Exposing fragile construction. Families didn't face one big failure. They faced constant erosion. Vega ownership followed a familiar arc. At first, relief, low fuel bills, easy driving, familiar controls, then frustration, then acceptance. Parents learned to carry coolant. They learned which warning signs to ignore and which meant pull over immediately. Many owners didn't hate the Vega, they just stopped trusting it. And when trust disappears, every journey becomes a calculation. The Chevrolet Vega taught families a harsh lesson. Brand loyalty doesn't guarantee protection. It showed how rushing innovation under pressure can backfire, especially when real-world use isn't forgiving. If the Pinto was about cost-cutting and the Beta was about overcomplexity, the Vega was about optimism without durability. And next, we come to a car that didn't even pretend to be cheerful, a car bought purely out of fear, economy, and shrinking options. No one dreamed of owning this car. That's the most honest place to start. The AMC Gremlin wasn't bought out of excitement, aspiration, or brand loyalty. It was bought because fuel prices had turned car ownership into a gamble, and this looked like the smallest bet on the table. When it appeared in the mid-1970s, the Gremlin was marketed as practical, efficient, and different enough to feel intentional rather than desperate. But make no mistake, this was a reaction car, a car born from panic, not confidence. Families didn't walk into AMC dealerships wanting a Gremlin, they walked in wanting reassurance. Technical makeup simple to a fault mechanically, the Gremlin was basic. Engines ranged from modest inline-4s to AMC's own straight-6 units. Power outputs were conservative. Performance was never the point. Rear-wheel drive, live rear axle, minimal insulation, minimal refinement. From a service standpoint, this simplicity was attractive. Any garage could work on it. Parts were cheap. Fuel consumption was predictable. But predictability doesn't equal comfort. The problems living with the compromise, the Gremlin's biggest issue wasn't catastrophic failure, it was daily fatigue. Noise levels were high, ride quality was harsh, interior materials wore quickly, build quality varied wildly depending on when and where the car was assembled, doors went out of alignment, trim rattled, electrical faults were common, rust arrived early, especially in colder climates. Weather sealing was poor, cabins aged fast. This wasn't a car that broke suddenly, it wore people down. Family experience, when good enough, became exhausting. Families tolerated the Gremlin more than they enjoyed it. Children remember the noise. Parents remember the embarrassment, not because the car looked strange, but because it felt temporary. This was a car people planned to replace the moment circumstances improved, but circumstances often didn't. So the Gremlin stayed, year after year, and with every year, it reminded its owners why they never wanted it in the first place. That's a different kind of burden, owning something you never emotionally accepted. Legacy WHAT, fear-based buying looks like. The AMC Gremlin stands as a symbol of fear-driven decision-making. It wasn't unsafe. It wasn't clever. It was simply enough. And sometimes enough is all people can manage. But when fear dictates design and purchase alike, the result isn't progress, it's endurance. And next, we look at a car that promised to escape this exact feeling. A car that claimed European sophistication could solve everything. And failed in a very different way. This was the car bought by people who thought they had solved the problem. Not panic buying, not downsizing in shame. This felt like adapting intelligently. The Cadillac Seville diesel arrived at a moment when fuel prices were frightening, but pride still mattered. It promised luxury without guilt, status without excess, a way to stay respectable while doing the right thing. Too many families, this felt like maturity, a car that said, "We're being responsible, not desperate." Technical promised the diesel solution under the bonnets at General Motors' 5.7-liter diesel V8. On paper, it sounded brilliant: diesel fuel economy, V8 smoothness, long-range cruising, lower running costs. GM took an existing petrol V8 architecture and adapted it to diesel operation. The assumption was simple: if it worked before, it could be modified to work again. That assumption was wrong. The problems when shortcuts collide with reality: diesel engines demand strength, high compression, robust internals. The Oldsmobile diesel didn't get enough of either. Head bolts failed, gaskets blew, fuel systems clogged. Cold starts were unreliable. Contaminated fuel, common at the time, destroyed injection systems. Repairs were complex, expensive, and often ineffective. Worst of all, failures didn't happen immediately. They arrived after warranties ended. Owners felt betrayed, not unlucky. Family stories: the cost of trying to stay dignified. Families who bought these cars didn't expect perfection. They expected stability. Instead, they got repeated garage visits, missed workdays, repair bills that didn't match the promise of savings. Some owners abandoned diesel entirely afterward. Others abandoned GM. The shame wasn't owning the car, it was explaining why such an expensive decision had gone so wrong. This wasn't a cheap car punishing cheap buyers. This was a smart-looking car punishing careful ones. Legacy: when responsibility becomes a trap. The Cadillac diesel experiment left scars. It damaged trust not just in diesel technology, but in corporate reassurance. It showed what happens when solutions are rushed to meet fear-driven markets. If earlier cars in this story were compromises made under pressure, this one was a compromise made under confidence, and that made the failure hurt more. And now we come to the final car in this story, not the worst, not the cheapest, but perhaps the most honest. This is the car nobody tells stories about, and that's exactly why it matters. When families bought a Toyota Corolla in the late 1970s, they weren't chasing hope or image, they were abandoning both. This wasn't a car you argued about, it wasn't a car you defended to friends, it was the car you chose when you were tired of being wrong. For many parents, this purchase didn't feel like success. It felt like surrender. Technical reality: why it kept going mechanically. The Corolla was conservative to the point of dullness. Small displacement inline for engines, modest horsepower figures, simple carburation, overbuilt internals for the output they produced. Nothing was pushed, nothing was rushed. Suspension design was basic, but durable. Gearboxes were understressed, cooling systems had margin. Toyota engineered for neglect, not excellence. And that mattered because real families are not test engineers. The problems or lack of them: the Corolla's biggest flaw was emotional. It didn't feel special, it didn't feel clever, it didn't reward enthusiasm, but it also didn't punish indifference. Breakdowns were rare, rust protection was better than average. Parts availability was strong. Ownership costs stayed predictable, which by this point felt like luxury. Family experience: when relief replaced excitement. Parents describe a strange shift after buying one. The constant vigilance disappeared. No more watching temperature gauges. No more calculating whether a journey was worth the risk. The car faded into the background, and that was the point. Children don't remember these cars vividly. They remember arriving on time, and that's the quiet victory most people overlook. Legacy: why this car ends the story. The Toyota Corolla doesn't fit neatly alongside the others in this list. It didn't destroy budgets, it didn't break hearts, it simply worked, and in doing so, it exposed a truth the industry didn't want to admit. Innovation means nothing without restraint. This car didn't buy admiration, it bought time, and sometimes time is the most valuable thing a family can afford. When you line these cars up together, it's easy to argue about which one was worse, which one broke more often, which one cost more to keep alive. But that misses the point. What connects all of them isn't engineering failure, it's pressure. Each of these cars represents a moment where families were forced to choose between imperfect options, not because they were careless, but because the margin for error had vanished. The Pinto showed what happens when cost targets outrank human trust. The Lancia proved that cleverness without durability becomes cruelty. The Vega exposed how optimism collapses under real-world use. The Gremlin embodied fear-based compromise. The Cadillac Diesel punished people who tried to stay dignified while adapting. And the Corolla showed what surrender to reality looks like. Different paths, same destination. What these cars took from families wasn't just money. They took energy, attention, emotional bandwidth. Every breakdown stole time from work. Every repair delayed something else, a holiday, a renovation, a plan. Every bad decision echoed longer than anyone expected. And yet families survived them. Not because the cars were good, but because the people adapted. That's the part history forgets. And that's the part you need to remember. Because one day you'll face your own version of this choice. Different technology, different pressure, same math. And when you do, these stories won't sound old. They'll sound familiar. When you look back at these cars, you might wonder why we didn't wait, why we didn't save longer, why we didn't hold out for something better. The honest answer is simple. Waiting was a luxury we didn't have. These cars weren't chosen to impress history. They were chosen to keep life moving forward. Every dull dashboard, every underpowered engine, every compromise bought something you can't see in old photos: stability. They bought uninterrupted schooling. They bought predictable mornings. They bought the ability to plan more than a month ahead. Some of these cars failed us. Some merely tolerated us, and one or two quietly did exactly what they promised. But none of them were pointless, because the goal was never to win. It was to avoid losing. The industry learned from this era sometimes. Painfully, safety standards changed, quality control tightened, durability stopped being a marketing afterthought. Modern cars are better because families like ours absorbed the cost of progress early. That's the part brochures never mention. So when you judge these machines, and you will judge them in context, not as objects but as tools used under pressure. We didn't buy bad cars because we didn't know better. We bought the least bad options available. And if you're lucky, you'll never have to make choices this narrow. But if you do, remember this: a car doesn't have to be loved to be meaningful. It just has to carry you far enough for the next chapter to begin. Now I want to turn this back to you, because these stories don't belong to one family. They belong to an entire generation that learned to live with less certainty than they expected. Did your parents or grandparents own any of these cars? Was there a vehicle in your family that was bought reluctantly but remembered forever? Maybe it wasn't the worst car on paper. Maybe it was just the wrong car at the wrong time. Share those stories below. Not the specs, not the reviews, the experience. If you value automotive stories that explain why cars were bought, not just whether they were good or bad, then this channel is for you. We're not here to rank cars. We're here to understand decisions. And next time we'll look at the opposite side of this equation: the cars everyone trusted blindly and shouldn't have, because every generation believes it's smarter than the last. And every generation learns the same lesson eventually. Thanks for watching, and remember, every car carries more than passengers. It carries the consequences of the time it was born into.